I am not a medical professional. I am an herbalist. I have been studying most of my life. I study in particular poisons, um, poisons, entheogens, abortifacients, because most of them are poisons, um, things that are dangerous to play around with, because that's my specialty. It's where my interest lays. I've also taken quite a few advanced classes in organic chemistry. I'm still not a medical doctor, and this class in no way should be taken to constitute medical advice, the diagnosis or treatment of any medical condition, um, or advice that you go out and ingest any of the herbs that we get into. We are not, absolutely not, telling you to use any of these materials. In fact, some of them will straight up kill you if you do. People who are desperate did terribly dangerous things to escape their desperate situation, and those things sometimes took their lives. And we will be discussing what they did that was severely unsafe, what they did that was less unsafe, what they did that was safer, um, because we believe that it is important to document this historical information. Of course, it's not as a recommendation to anyone, just to document. All right, before we get into the actual herbal abortifacients and the history of the use of pennyroyal, the history of the use of columbine or birthwort, and those classes are going to be going into it the same way our entheogen classes go into it. You know, what's the LD50? How were people actually applying these? What were different historical recipes that got written down? What are the dangers of these? We're going to talk about history. And I know you love it when I go on historical rants, right? That's totally what everyone turns into my classes for. I already did a class on the history of abortion, sort of. I did a class on different religious and spiritual perspectives on religion from ancient historical texts. So their own holy books, their own, what did their scribes write down that their religion believed about abortion. We already did that class. You can find it in our YouTube channel. This is more about how did something that was in such common use in Europe and America become criminalized? And what does that criminalization tell us? What was the root of it? How did something that was so common become something that is so vilified? So we're actually going to go all the way back to the medieval era, and I will try and fit this in one, maybe two classes, and then we're going to pick an herb and we're going to start with it. I actually thought we would probably start with some of the things that, no, really, you shouldn't do, like stick crocodile dung up inside yourself, because that was really common in ancient Egypt and is super dangerous. There are parasites that exist in crocodile dung that can be transmitted that way. We'll get into that. Anyway, before I start, I just want to say a couple of things. So, we do our best to be very clear when we, as instructors, whether it's me, whether it's Ian, whether it's somebody else, to be upfront and honest about when we are presenting objective fact versus subjective opinion. This class is going to contain both. It is going to contain objective fact. We know that this was what was on the books at the time. We know that this is what priests wrote down. We know that this is what the law was. This is just documented history and it's not up for debate. I'm not going to debate anyone on any of that stuff. I'm not. I can give you my sources if you'd like to read it yourself, but I'm not in the mood today. I'm really not in the mood today. But this class is also going to contain my subjective opinion about why certain shifts occurred. Now, it is an educated subjective opinion. It is a subjective opinion that many other cultural anthropologists share with me. It is a subjective opinion that other historians share with me. And friendly reminder, my degree is actually in history. But I might be willing to engage in some friendly debate about my subjective opinion, but not about the objective fact. Everybody clear? Cool? Moving right along. Let's talk about the medieval period. Okay? Because, whew, wow, do I keep seeing people misrepresent the position that was originally held by the Christian Church and the Catholic Church, and by Europeans in history. Abortion right now, I keep seeing being portrayed as some kind of ill of modern society and proof of like the moral decay rampant in the times. And it's proof that, you know, this feminism's gone too far. Friendly reminder that not only women have abortions and that trans men and non-binary people do too, but I keep seeing it portrayed as this modern illness. I don't agree that it is an illness. I don't agree that there's anything wrong with an abortion. I think that they should be legal. But I keep seeing it treated as like this modern thing that's so weird, and it's proof that, like, oh, our society's crumbling. But abortion was really common in the medieval era. It was really common in the medieval era. So I'm going to get into it. So one of the ideas that people have about the medieval period is that everyone got married very, very young. Everyone was married to one person in a monosexual relationship for the rest of their lives. This was always performed in a church. There seems to be this conception that there's not a lot of premarital sex going on, and certainly not a great deal of abortion. This is actually super inaccurate. It's completely ahistorical. Noble families that had multiple children could only pass on their property to the eldest. The rest of their children would remain in the household, even as adults, until they married other property-holding people, or until circumstances changed. Many entered the church, where marriage and concubinage amongst the clergy was still common. So that's something to know, was that marriage amongst people in the church was common until the 12th century. Priests and of both genders were actually encouraged to marry in order to show a good example to their congregation of a holy marriage. Now, some of those were platonic marriages and some of those were sexual marriages, depending upon which sect of the church you belonged to, but marriage in the church was very common. Wealthy families might decide that some of their younger sons could go on to become squires and then knights and train to be in the military. There was a lot of homosexuality amongst knights in the medieval era. It was super common. And the primary sin associated with it was fornication. Our idea of sodomy and a medieval monk's idea of sodomy don't match. They don't match. All sin was judged as belonging in certain categories, and any sex that you had that wasn't to have a baby to pass on property was all kind of considered like, oh, yes, you sinned, apologize to God, and move on with your lives, including the rather rampant homosexual sex acts that occurred amongst knights. As for royal daughters, there weren't a lot of people for them to marry. So the larger the family got, the less chance that their younger children would marry anyone. Knights didn't get married until they were given land. Literally landed knights were allowed to get married. None of the others were. So there was a lot of premarital or extramarital sex. It was incredibly common. Both homosexual and heterosexual extramarital sex it was going on all the time. And this was in the higher classes. In the lower classes, marriage was kind of a fluid concept. It was very common for people to just say, we're married, whether the church had been involved or not. And it was quite common for those marriages to be seen as completely valid. Divorce was also quite common. You could essentially say, like, we're married and we're living together, and then you know what, that marriage didn't work out and we're splitting our property and we're going to move in with other people now. According to Gratian's Decretum, all it took to make a marriage legal was 3 things: love, sex, and consent. That's it. Love, sex, consent. That's what made a medieval marriage amongst the lower classes. So because the line between fornication in the eyes of the church and legal marriage was a little bit blurry, fornication was more or less accepted in practice. You know, it could be on the books as not okay, but it basically happened everywhere, anywhere. Anyway, there are lots of records of penitence, basically people coming forward and saying, I am penitent, I have done this thing that I'm not supposed to do. And sex outside of marriage, going all the way through the 12th century, was listed as something that it would be a minor penitential. Sort of like a tisk tisk, don't do that again. Members of the Synod of Angers in 1217 stated unequivocally that they personally knew many confessors who gave no penance for it at all. Not even like nothing. Not kneel and say this many prayers, not give us this much money. They basically didn't see it as worth even assigning a penance. In practice, the church didn't care until it involved adultery. So basically, if you were in a marriage and then you had sex outside the marriage with somebody else and you owned property, that's when the church cared. And they cared because it complicated the line of succession, which is one of the reasons why it targeted people with uteruses and not people with penises. And even then, the medieval stance on that was a little different, because you could also give a rise to bastards using your penis, and that complicated succession. Anyway, moving right along. Prostitution, sex work, was both legal and very common. Although the church did not condone it, it didn't stop it from both regulating it and profiting from it. The church was one of the biggest controllers of how sex work played out and who got paid what in the medieval era. Basically, the idea was that a lot of unmarried cis men joined the church or joined the military, and they would either have the choice of like just going without, which of course the church would prefer, having sex with each other, which the church would not really prefer, or having sex with sex workers, which the church was like, okay, I guess that's the least of our concerns. They viewed it as a necessary evil. While active sex workers were not viewed as respectable members of society, they nonetheless were viewed as performing an important public service. Outside of the church, many medieval writers, such as Albertus Mangus and Constantine the African, viewed sex as a crucial component to the overall health of a person and the overall health of society. They equated sex as being a need. I don't necessarily agree. I think sexual release is. I don't think that sex with a partner is, and I think that leads down a dangerous road. But they equated it as being the same as food, sleep, and exercise, and listed it as one of the ways to get rid of your toxic humors and rebalance the body. They said that abstinence led to weakness, illness, mental illness, and death. Intriguingly, in medieval Europe, they believed that this was true for cis women as well. They said that if you were assigned female at birth and you identified as a woman, so running around with genitals that match your genital or gender identity, if you didn't have orgasms, then it imbalanced your humors as well. And one of the grounds for medieval divorce was not getting orgasms from your husband. Yeah. Sex happened. Sex happened all over the place. And inevitably, pregnancy happened too. Intriguingly, there was a really interesting idea about this. We talked in our class about spiritual perspectives on abortion, about this term quickening, that you weren't considered pregnant until the baby moved and people could put their hand on your tummy and feel the baby move, right? This is actually a little more complex than that. That was very much the Renaissance perspective, or the late medieval period. In the early medieval period, they actually separated it further. You had cycles, you had these menstrual cycles, right? And they were considered as being part of the balance of humors within your body. And if they stopped, you were fully viewed as being within your right to go get herbs from a midwife or a priest in order to restore the balance of your humors and restart your menstrual cycle. There was this concept that you weren't really pregnant yet. At that point, it was more about getting the menstrual cycle to start again because your menstrual cycle had ceased, and that was a concern. And then you get into the concept of quickening versus not quickened yet. But if you were before the window where there was any visible bump at all, you weren't considered pregnant. You were considered as having ceased your menstrual flow and needing to start it again. And that was a service that you could get, like I said, from a priest. They would give you their herbs. Remedies to regulate the menstrual cycle were very common. They were not only written down in household handbooks that we still have, so that they could be made at home by your mom, by your grandma, by your aunties, but they were written down by monks. In fact, the 9th century recipe that appears in the Lorsch manuscript was written down by Benedictine monks, and it was to regulate stomach aches caused by the cessation of menstrual flow. What does that sound like? Also, it totally contained abortifacient herbs. Not only could you go to a monk to get an abortifacient, but abortions weren't necessarily considered immoral, even after the quickening. So if you look at like St. Thomas of Aquinas, he argued that the soul didn't enter the body until the baby drew its first breath. But other monks are written as debating back and forth whether it was moral to bring a child into a family if that would cause the death of the person who was pregnant, or if it would cause the death of the other older children via starvation or via their lack of care from their parents. We have a record of Burchard's of Worms Decretum, which talks about the issue of abortion in Concerning Women's Vices. Burchard unequivocally opposed it, but he said that the severity of the sin was not dependent on the fact that you had had an abortion. Remembering at this point, an abortion is post-quickening, so we're talking a late term abortion, but why you had to have one. If you had one because your children were at risk or because you were at risk, oh, well, that's not a major sin. If you had one because you were trying to cover up for adultery, that was a major sin. It wasn't the abortion, it was the adultery. It wasn't the abortion, it was the lie. if you were poor and took the steps to have an abortion because you would not be able to feed the child, no penance was prescribed by the church, not even for what we would consider a late-term abortion. This went so far as to culminate in a court case that I found in the town of Brno of Moravia in the year 1353. Basically, a woman was caught trying to commit infanticide. She was caught trying to murder her just born baby in a river, drown the baby. And she went before 24 male jurors, 24, and they declared her not guilty. They declared her as not to be punished by any means. Why? Because she had attempted to have an abortion earlier and it failed, and she could not feed or take care of the baby. It was judged that she had tried to do the kinder thing rather than allow the infant to starve to death. And they viewed this as not a punishable offense. Okay? Now, I don't actually agree with infanticide. Here's where subjective opinion versus objective fact. I support abortion. I support abortion in basically all cases, and for all reasons. You like sex, you fucked up, condom broke, birth control didn't work. You want to have an abortion, you have one. It's your body. You can't have one because you're sick. You can't have one because you can't afford the baby. You can't have one because you're terrified of bringing a baby into this world. You have an abortion. I don't agree with infanticide. But I've also never been in a position where I know that my infant is going to starve to death. That I know they're going to starve to death. I've never been in that position. So I can't imagine her desperation. I'm not going to judge her. Anyway. The Catholic Church in, oh God, what is the name of that? Confession would ask people, have you drunk any maleficium, herbs or other agents that would make it so that you cannot have children? And if the answer was yes, they didn't get kicked out of the church. They weren't punished with death or imprisonment. They weren't even at risk of their families being told. They just had to make penance. And they only had to make penance if they didn't have a damn good reason for it. But I think I belabored that point. But let's move on into how medieval monks performed abortions, and it was seen as part of their miracles. Let's talk about that. Medieval biographies of multiple Irish Catholic saints, including Brigid of Kildare, record abortions amongst their saintly miracles as part of the proof that they had otherworldly, divinely given abilities. Medieval Irish Catholic penitentialists, priestly authorities who prescribed penances for sins and who were often celebrated as saints themselves, treated abortion as a relatively minor offense, as we talked about. And you could, under very specific circumstances, go to a monk and procure abortifacients. Not only that, but they actually celebrated some historical examples of abortions performed by priests as a sign of their godliness. The most detailed account is in Ciaran of Saigir, and I know that I am butchering that. I'm sorry. It's spelled C-I-A-R-A-N of S-A-I-G-I-R. Basically, this saint rescued a nun named Brunic who had been abducted and raped by a local king. He had basically been like, I am entitled to this person. This person is an object. I'm going to take this person and I'm going to rape them. A crime that continues to this day. So Ciaran of Saigir goes and rescues this woman and is told by her that she's pregnant, that she thinks the rape has gotten her pregnant. And the man of God, it is said, led by the zeal of justice and not wishing the serpent's seed to quicken, pressed down on her womb with the sign of the cross and forced her womb to be emptied. He performed a mystical abortion on her, and that's seen as part of his sainthood. Now, I'm always concerned about this story because it doesn't actually say whether she wanted that to happen. He just kind of decides for her that that's what's going to happen. That always bugged me. There's another example where a nun had been sneaking off and having sex and got pregnant, and she went to a saint, Kynec of Aghabol, and asked that Kynec of Aghabol save her from the perils of her fornications. And Kynec of Aghabol is said to have kissed the nun's belly, and at once the baby in her womb disappeared without a trace. And this is seen as a miracle. Brigide's devotee is said to have given thanks to God for performing an abortion by a saint. Okay. I think I got through that. So let's talk about how it changed. So in the medieval era, we have priests literally performing abortions, writing down the recipes of how to do so, giving the ingredients to people, literally performing abortions as an act of God. You have the belief sort of going back and forth on whether or not a baby is alive when it draws its first breath, or whether it's alive the first time it kicks hard enough to be felt through a uterus. But even then, you have this, okay, in certain circumstances, even post-quickening, it's acceptable to have an abortion. You have these court cases where people's right to make that decision is upheld over and over and over again. So what changed? So it started between the period of the 4th and 16th centuries. It was a long period of rampant change. We saw profound social and economic dislocations as Europe began to evolve from scattered small fiefdoms into larger, increasingly centralized ruling units. At this same time, you saw the development of universities and professional schools and the solidification of power in the hands of the church. So you went from having your neighborhood priest, who is just part of your community. He knows that you don't have enough food for all your kids, and your friends, and you're interdependent. You're very interdependent, to having power increasingly solidified in what we would think of as oligarchs, in what we would think of as wealthy, powerful, militarized rulers backed up by a rigid dogmatic church, and this rigid dogmatic church creating universities, and these universities centralizing power. Now, early in the start of this, you actually have women going to these professional schools and learning skills and taking it back to their communities as midwives and what we would call female physicians. I guess the closest thing to this would be sort of a combination between a gynecologist and oh God, I just forgot the name of it, a birth doctor. There's an actual name for that. Around this time, as we see these institutions popping up, there was this idea that, of course, some people who have uteruses and vaginas and breasts don't want to get naked with a strange man. They don't want to deliver a baby. Thank you, Ian, obstetrician. They don't want to deliver a baby for a man. They want to deliver a baby with a woman. And we want these to be successful deliveries, so women are allowed to come to our fancy smanchy universities, but only to learn about women's health, where, of course, a woman isn't allowed to learn all the stuff that we're learning at this university. That would be ridiculous. But stuff that has to do with, vaginas and uteruses. Yeah, okay. She can learn that, and she can take it back to communities So you get these midwives combining their historical knowledge of herbal abortifacients and then even up to borderline surgical techniques that they're learning in these universities. And they're taking them to their communities and they're using them. But in the 13th century, the universities started banning them on the basis of their gender, and saying that female physicians were a danger to the world. Now, intriguingly, this is around the same time as they started targeting female brewers. So we've talked before in our classes about how the brewing of beer used to be considered women's work, okay? It was a woman's art, it was a woman's industry. I'm saying women, I'm just gonna say this would include any person who, woke up one day and was like, I am a woman, and dressed up as a woman and continued living their life as a woman. So this absolutely does involve trans women as well. In fact, there's some documented cases of trans women, operating at this time. Like they've always existed. So yeah, women and trans women. Brewing was something that was done by women, and it was a women's owned industry, and it was actually something that you could do that provided you with an income that you did not need a man to obtain. That was weaving, that was brewing, and that was midwifery, and being, for lack of better terms, the early gynecologists and obstetricians of the world. And in some cases they were actually like all three. But a lot of the brewers made medicinal brews that a modern witch would be like, oh, that's witchcraft, and a modern herbalist would be like, oh, that's herbalism. But these brews, now intriguingly, beer was for kids and ale was for adults. I'm not kidding. And the beer that we drink now is very different from the beer they made. But they basically had this form of independence as brewers, as weavers, as midwives. And yep, small beers were for children. And they began to face a great deal of opposition around the 13th century, both from secular and clerical authorities. Secular authorities started pushing a narrative that there was something different about women's brains, different about women's abilities. And all of a sudden we went from this medieval period where women are seen as fucking equal and deeply needed by society. Their work was super important. Without it, everybody crumbles, everybody dies. To women being seen as this lesser, weaker sex, and that idea spreading through secular authorities. And you get the clerical authorities describing women as being wicked and evil, and the arts that they preserve as being a form of witchcraft. And you start seeing, starting in the 13th century, a demonization of midwifery, and in order to do it, a demonization of abortion. Basically, you start seeing the midwives who perform abortions being described as performing witchcraft. And I mean, you can start by looking at Thomas of Aquinas's testimony that sex is supposed to be solely for procreation, and women basically exist as a tool of procreation, and any interference with natural laws of reproduction is immoral because it violated the right reason of biblical law. But it definitely wasn't just him. That sort of was early hinting at it. You start seeing the Catholic Church realizing that if they regulate abortifacients, if they regulate brewing, if they regulate midwifery, and if they suppress it as witchcraft, they can strip the power, the independence, and the money away from these independent women and deprived them of their position in society that gave them a voice, that gave them authority, and that gave them the ability to at all challenge the church's authority. So you see them being targeted out, and there's starting to be a clear link between the demonization of sexual activity and midwifery and herbalism. And it even goes all the way up to Salem. So we're going to get into the Puritans here in a minute. But in Salem, one of the most famous trials of a witch was of Anne Hutchinson, a practicing midwife. And one of the things she was accused of was using her midwifery inappropriately. Of the almost 200 women accused in Salem of practicing witchcraft, 20% of them were midwives. 20%. One of the things that happened with medical men around this time period, people who went to the universities and studied, is they said in a papal decree that if a woman dared to give any kind of medical cure without having studied at one of their universities, then she is automatically a witch and has to die. Except they were turning them away from the same places they had studied. They said, you can't come in on the basis of your gender, but also if you didn't train from us and you continue practicing medicine, well then you're automatically a witch and you have to die. It was a papal decree. So, I recommend taking a look at how the papacy changed around this time. So, for example, the papal witch bull of 1484 denounced witches specifically as hindering men from performing the sexual act and women from conceiving and having slain infants in the woman's womb. So literally a papal act defined witches as performing abortions. That was one of their standards for what made a witch, was that you performed abortion. Midwives who performed abortions were accused of committing witchcraft in the Malus Maleficarum in 1487. Yeah. This is absolutely tied together. Now there's some debate. I've sat in a room with a panel of experts and had someone tell me that no witches ever performed abortion. That was just Catholic persecution propaganda, and that midwives who performed abortions and witches were never the same thing, and that witches were actually all priestesses of an underground religion that worshipped a god and a goddess and humankind's connection with nature, and that they never actually studied any poisonous plants or entheogens. They never brewed beer. That basically there was a conflation created by the Catholic Church as a tool of persecuting these ancient priestesses who were actually all pacifists who would never commit an abortion because all life is sacred. That's what she told me. And she's a high priestess, so she should know, right? Subjective opinion? I think that there are absolutely witches out there who aren't women, trans or otherwise, who didn't perform abortions, who don't perform abortions. I think there are absolutely midwives, and that there were midwives at the time who were not witches, and who were in fact accused of witchcraft as a means of stripping them of their power. I think that those midwives were falsely accused of witchcraft and tortured, okay? I also think that there is a history of witches who were herbalists and midwives and beer brewers because I've met them, because it's who I trained under. So when I'm told that they never existed, I'm like, it's complicated. It's a complicated history. There are witches who never did those things. There are herbalists who never did witchcraft. And there are spectrum between the two. There is a spectrum between the two. Anyway, let's talk about the Puritans. Because, geez, that's the other example. The Puritans. Because I keep hearing that we want America to go back. We want it to go back to when it was so good, right? Right? To when this kind of shit didn't happen. This is this sign of, the turpentine dissolving the moral standards of today, right? That's the narrative here, that somehow we've gone adrift. Okay? No, we haven't. No, we haven't. Because the Puritans were having abortions all over the place. Okay? We picture the Puritans, the first English settlers who were Calvinists, by the way, Calvinist Puritans, as these strict, foreboding people who never had sex. And honestly, we can point a lot of blame at Nathaniel Hawthorne for that, which portrays Puritan society, his book, The Scarlet Letter, as deeply religious, dark, and unforgiving. He painted as being very pious and very austere. And yeah, he was an author, and he was subjective opinion, but he was kind of a terrible author. And his portrayal of abortion or pregnancy or adultery in Puritan society is just inaccurate. In reality, Puritans were actually quite progressive, at least for their time, when it came to sexual conduct. Puritans believed that marital sex for pleasure was important, and that marriage was a contract of love, not just economic property distribution and procreation. Although premarital and extramarital sex was illegal, they were very common, and enforcement was hardly ever actually carried through with, and it wasn't very strict when it was. The legal documents of the time are rife with examples of sexual offenses, and the percentage of firstborn children that were born early or completely out of wedlock is around 40%. 40% of all children were born too early or out of wedlock during the colonial era. Since the Puritans believed that you could be godly whether you had children or not, which was, again, kind of rare at the time, and also believed that life began at the quickening. When you first felt the baby kick, there was no outlawing abortion before the quickening, and they were quite common. The Puritans brought their laws over from England, where the procedure was also legal until quickening. Although they changed a lot of laws that they brought over from England once they came and made their own place, they kept that one, allowing people who were pregnant to choose when and if they would become mothers, whether that was the first time or the sixth or seventh or eighth time. Pre-quickening abortions were performed largely by midwives who knew which herbs would cause a person to abort. American medical books from the time give instructions even for suppressing the courses of a person's menstrual cycle so they can't get pregnant. So not only did they regularly practice pre-quickening abortions, and the church knew about it and had no problem with it, they also practiced contraception commonly, and it was in the books that basically everyone had access to. Okay. Moving right along. Surgical abortions were really rare, I will say, and they were actually kind of frowned upon, but surgical abortions were frowned upon because you weren't supposed to cut on the body. Unless there was like dire need, and why would you do that if you had access to herbs? So we're at 6:53, which means that I think we're going to pick up next time on abortion at the turn of the 19th century and when the American Medical Association was formed and how birth became big business. It became a tool of nationalist imperialism, and it became a tool of profit for the people in power. And so we see a criminalization of abortion taking place then. Before I move into that though, I want to touch on something. So when I was constructing this class, and we will pick up next time on the creation of the American Medical Association and the father of modern gynecology, who's responsible for a lot of the anti-abortion rhetoric that persists to this day, and why he pushed that rhetoric. That's what we'll pick up on next week. But while I was constructing this, I came to a conclusion about anti-abortion rhetoric. And I found that it traces to several root causes over and over and over again. And I found it a lot while I was doing this. Now, this is, again, subjective opinion. Everything I just rattled off about the medieval monks performing abortions and the Puritans not actually having any problem with it or pre-quickening, that's just historical fact. You can try and debate me about it, but it just is. That was just the truth. The next part that I'm going to talk about is subjective analysis, okay? So what I've found is that primarily pushing people to have a baby when they can't have a baby has several root causes. And one of them I'm going to touch on a little bit more next week, which is making slaves have kids. So in the 1600s and 1700s, several physicians, including a really badass female historian who was a botanist and a physician and documented plants all over the world, documented that slaves often performed abortions on themselves and on their families. And when questioned about it, they would reveal that they did not want to have children who would just be born into slavery and enslaved. They did not want to give their enslavers, the people who tortured them and raped them and sold them as chattel and who forced every minute of their lives to be working for no benefit to them, who treated them as less than human. They didn't want them to have access to their children so that they could do it to them. And the only thing they could control was their bodies and their choice to have a child or not. And one of the reasons why the colonies started cracking down so hard on abortions was because the slaves were aborting the baby slaves so that their children were born into chattel slavery. Okay? Secondarily, I find that there's a lot of white nationalism. So it's weird because the same people in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s who were like, no, white women have to be having babies because if you don't have babies, the other people will outnumber us. We're also trying to make sure that slaves continued to have babies and that indentured classes and oppressed and marginalized and dehumanized classes would continue having babies because they needed a workforce. But then they're having babies that are pushed into this workforce. And so white women have to have babies too because now the brown people are going to outnumber us because we didn't let them have abortions. Okay? So you have keeping people enslaved, and you have racism, and you have nationalism, because a lot of the rhetoric in the 1800s was all about like, no, our nation has to have babies because that other nation over there is having babies, and if our birth rate falls, well then, we won't be able to compete in a nationalist, imperialist, militaristic arena. So we have to have babies. In fact, you can find this rhetoric amongst the Nazis. Both the, these genetically pure women have to breed, and also they need to make lots of babies for the war machine. More meat for the grinder. Okay? So you see it to keep people enslaved, and you see it as a tool of racism, and you see it as a tool of imperialism, and you see it as a means of keeping people trapped in marriages that don't serve them. One of the things we're going to get into with the American Medical Association was that there was suddenly this fear of women pushing to have the right to vote, and women pushing to have the right to go to colleges, and women pushing to have the right to work and to support themselves sans the efforts of a man. And a lot of the doctors who formed the American Medical Association wrote very publicly about how they needed to make sure that women didn't have abortions, because if women had abortions, they wouldn't have to stay married and stay in a form of institutionalized chattel slavery to their husbands. I'm not kidding. They wrote about it. They wrote about how if we keep permitting women to just casually have abortions, well, then why will they stay in these unhealthy, terrible situations with these men who own them as property and can lock them in an asylum if they don't do what they want? Why would they stay if they can leave? So they make it so that you can't leave. Now, again, that really targets cis, assigned female at birth women who are in heteronormative relationships, but the people who were writing the laws were seeing that. They were looking at society through that lens when they wrote the laws. And they wanted to make sure that those cis, assigned female at birth people didn't have any other option. They had to stay if they got pregnant, and they had to mother their children, and they couldn't go to school, and they couldn't vote. And that was part of it. So we have keep people enslaved, a tool of racism, a tool of imperialism, and a tool of controlling, the spouse in heterosexual, cis relationships, cis monosexual, Judeo-Christian relationships, okay? And then, lastly, it's a tool of treating the body as if it belongs to the state, making it so people are property of the state. And it's the same reason why the state thinks it has the right to sterilize Native American women or sterilize Romani women. The attitudes of why you can't have an abortion include the no, you don't know what's best for society, and you don't know what's best for you. We know what's best for society, and we know what's best for you. And that includes experimenting on you with syphilis if you are one of 800 black men, or sterilizing you against your will if you are in prison in California. These are the main rhetorics here. And as we get into how it got shaped and how power got taken away from the midwives and how power got taken away from people to make their own decisions with their own bodies and why it's happening now, those are the 5 that I've seen over and over and over again. Now, if you've seen other ones, please feel free to include them. But, oh, I'm sorry. There's kind of a 6th one, and I forgot. Money. Right now, we have a private healthcare system. During when the AMA formed, there were a lot of male physicians going, well, if we control birth, then we get the money from it. During when they started forbidding people from entering the colleges in the medieval era, the late medieval era, and the early Renaissance era, part of the things behind that was money. They wanted to make money. They wanted that sweet, sweet beer money. They wanted that sweet, sweet midwifery money, and they didn't want the money to be in the hands of anyone but them. Okay? So 6 reasons that I found over and over and over again as I've done the research for these classes. Anyway, next time, we're going to pick up on the formation of the American Medical Association and the father of modern gynecology, and how the laws started shifting in the 1850s to take power away from the person via bodily autonomy and put it in the hands of the state and put it in the hands of their husbands, where their husbands get to make certain decisions. And that persists into an issue we're going to be covering in sex ed this week, which is genital mutilation. And the fact that people still ask husbands whether the wives should have a husband stitch put in. And people still demand that you get your husband's permission and you have 2 kids before you can have a hysterectomy. Yeah, regardless of whether you're married or not, and what gender identity you have, you can't have it taken out even if it's killing you. It's all interconnected. So tune in at some point this week. I will make an announcement on Patreon and Facebook about us doing the genital mutilation class for our sex education classes. And then tune in next Tuesday for discussion of the formation of the American Medical Association. Okay. Thank you all for watching. As a reminder, we do have a Patreon. Every little bit helps us provide education, advocacy, counseling, and assistance during domestic crisis. And if you have any questions that are politely worded and respectful, please leave them in the comments below, or you can email me. Good night, everyone. Be safe out there. Have a great night.